we're going to be looking at history and heritage together. It's going to be, there are going to be points of redundancy. That means there will be times when I repeat myself. Things that I've said one place, I'll say again in another place because we need to be reminded. And I think it's safe to do that because that's the way Jesus did it when he taught. You know, there's going to be some things that may be new to some of you. There are things that should not be new to any of us if we're Baptists, but they are. We're even going to take a test this morning in this first one and see who you know and who you should know. Our life's verse is Hosea 4:6. It says, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge because thou hast rejected me." Now he's speaking to Israel here. Okay, he's not speaking to an individual, but because thou hast rejected knowledge, I will also reject thee, that thou shalt be no priest to me, seeing thou hast forgotten the law of thy God. I will also forget thy children. Now, the first part is bad enough. We're being destroyed as Baptists because we don't know our history. We don't know who we are. We don't know why we're Baptists. We don't know what makes us different from the Protestants and the Catholics. We have been Protestantized, which is the word I may use from time to time in this. Before I go any further, this series is based on this book which I wrote. I have a few copies back there. I have some others. I have one, Universal Church of Fact or Fiction, some other books back there. I wish I could just say, just take one, but I can't because it costs me money to get them. I would take $10 for any book. If that's too much, let me know and we'll negotiate, okay? This book, for example, sells on Amazon for $12.95. And you can get my books on Amazon. I've written about 15 altogether. But anyway, it's important that we know who we are. It's important that we understand that. But what's important, if we go to the next point, it should be the last part of the verse, if I can get there on mine. The last part of the verse said, "Seeing thou hast forgotten," I'm not used to having somebody else do this, "forgotten the law of thy God, I will also forget thy children." Now that's something we need to think about. What about the next generation? I mean, I look at what's going on in the world, and I think that the rapture could come anytime, really, more than ever before in my life. I think even us old guys that are 80 years old and older will see the rapture. That's how close I think we are. But the point is, if it's not, if the rapture is 100 or 200 years from now, what about our children? What about our grandchildren? You know, I've got 4 grandchildren or great-grandchildren now that I am really concerned about. They're getting saved before the rapture because I don't know what happens to them if they're too young when the rapture comes. The Bible doesn't tell me, and it worries me. We should be concerned about that. We go on to the next one. I'm going to change what I'm doing here so I can do this better. Okay? I want to test your knowledge here. Okay, give me the first click. Give me the first one. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at my screen. I should be looking at that screen. Okay. How many of you heard of this guy, John Wesley? You notice it's got an M after there. You know why? He was a Methodist. Okay, how about the next one? D.L. Moody. We've heard of him. He was a Congregationalist. The next one. C.I. Schofield. Many of us older Christians, Baptists, were raised on a Schofield Bible. Well, he was a Congregationalist. And then he became a Presbyterian, and he pastored, and he was divorced and remarried. So that's that man. Okay, next one. George Whitefield. And let's go ahead and get the next one in here before I make a comment. Okay, George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards were responsible for the Great Awakening back in colonial days. They were both Anglicans. That means Church of England. And then the next one, Charles Finney. Charles Finney was a Presbyterian. Billy Sunday was a Presbyterian. Martin Luther, obviously he was a Lutheran. And John Calvin, he was Reformed. He was a Calvinist, obviously he's Calvin, but he was the Reformed Church, the Dutch Reformed, the Presbyterian Church, your Reformed churches in France. They're all under this guy. Not one of these guys was a Baptist. Okay, let's go to the next page. All right, the first one on here, John Clark. How many of you have heard of John Clark? couple of you. John Clark is the man who started the first Baptist church on American soil. If you've read church history, you've heard it was Roger Williams. It wasn't. It was John Clark. If you've read church history, I'm getting ahead of myself, we're going to cover this again, but if you read church history, you say that Roger Williams started Rhode Island. Well, he started to start it, but they went to England to get the charter from the king, and the king said no, and Roger Williams came home, and John Clark spent another 12 years in England fighting until they got the charter to start Rhode Island, the first place with a government giving freedom of religion. Okay, the next one. Obadiah Holmes. How many have heard of him? Okay, Obadiah Holmes was a Baptist preacher, was run out of Massachusetts, and he came back in, was having a service in his friend's house who was sick, and he was nearly beat to death for holding an unauthorized service. Next one is Isaac Backus. Isaac Backus was a Baptist preacher. He was a historian, just one of the men that was responsible for us having the influence we have in America as Baptists. Shubal Stearns. Shubal Stearns was saved under Jonathan Edwards, and I think he was in Connecticut. He was a Congregationalist, nominal. He started reading his Bible. He became a Baptist and moved to North Carolina and started the greatest revival America has ever seen, and it's still affecting us in North Carolina today, and he was back before the Revolution. But you never heard of him. Next one. Daniel Marshall, and go ahead and get the next one, Abraham Marshall. These were a father and son evangelistic team that started many Baptist churches in the South. Out of Shubal Stearns' revival, these men are out of that also. They started churches from Virginia, the Carolinas, South Carolina, Georgia, Kentucky, Tennessee. All that area, they started Baptist churches in those areas, but you've never heard of them. Next one, John Gano. How many of you have ever seen the movie The Patriot? There was a church that was burned with all the people inside. Now that was a made-up story. It was a combination. Mel Gibson, the part he played was actually 3 or 4 different men combined into one. It's not very historically accurate, but the church was burned. And John Gano was the pastor of that church, a Baptist church. They don't show that in the film. And he was George Washington's chaplain in the Army. Okay, next one. John Leyland. John Leyland was a preacher in Virginia who was running against James Madison for Congress when he was going to win. I mean, they didn't have the polls like we did today, but they knew he was going to win. And James Madison and him got together. When James Madison promised to get the First Amendment into the Constitution, Leyland stepped out. But we wouldn't have the First Amendment without John Leyland. Isaac McCoy. I can't remember his name, but there's a very well-known missionary back from colonial days that I've heard talked about a lot. But this guy, Isaac McCoy, was a bigger missionary, lived a very short life, had a lot of health problems, to the Indians in America. Every one of these men is a Baptist, and very few of you have heard of any of them. Something's wrong with that. We know all the Protestant heroes, and we don't know the Baptist heroes. That's what I mean, we're destroyed for lack of knowledge. I don't have time to cover all these, but we'll get into some more depth on some of these. Now, what are we looking for? We want to trace Baptist history from the time of Christ till today. So what are we looking for? Are we looking for the Baptist name? No, we're looking for the kind of church that Jesus promised to build in Matthew 16:18. It says, "And I say also unto thee that thou art Peter, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." We're looking for the kind of church he promised to build there. Let's go to the next point. This kind of church we want to trace. We want to find out what today is the same kind of church as there was that was started way back then. And by the way, there are some Dutch historians, and I have the quote later on in the series, that say that there's only one church that can make that, or one group of Christians that can make that claim, and it's the Baptists. And that's Dutch Reformed historians to say that. We don't believe in the perpetuity of the church, or the the continuance of the church because we can prove it historically. That's not why we believe it. On the next point, we believe it because Jesus himself promised that the gates of hell would not prevail against it. Okay, it's not because we can prove it historically. Next point. If there ever was a time when the kind of church that was started in the New Testament did not exist, then Jesus is either a liar or incompetent, because he promised to keep it. Although there is historical evidence, we can trace the churches through history. We can't do it as a straight line chain where we can go from this church to this church to this church to this church. There are those who claim we can, but we can't. But we can find this type of church in every period of history, from the time of the apostles till today. They weren't always called by the same name, but it's ultimately a matter of faith. Do you believe God or do you not believe God? That's what it comes down to. And God said, God, said he would preserve it, and so I believe he did. Okay, next one. This is an important point. It's not the name. Next click. We all know what this is, right? Next click. It's an apple. But not if you speak French. If you speak French, next click, it's a poem. How about if you speak Basque? This is spoken in the Pyrenees Mountains down in southern France and northern Spain. It's a cigarra. Next click. But no matter what you call it, it's still an apple. So we're not looking at what the name was carried by that church down in history. We're looking for the essence of that church, what it was made up like. Because if we try to trace Baptist name down through there, you'll find it. You can do it in a very general sense, because they try and tell us, I'm getting ahead of myself again, but I can't help it. They try and tell us that Anabaptists started after the Reformation. I have traced the term, not in English, of course, because English isn't that old, but I've traced the rebaptizer name back to the 2nd century, about 150 AD. And so we can trace it in general, but not in specific churches. Next slide. Here are 12 characteristics, and you could put more on here. And later we're going to look at the Baptist distinctives, as we call them. I'm going to maintain that there's really only one, but 12 characteristics. First of all, a New Testament church is patterned after the New Testament pattern. It's the same type of church there was. It's local and visible. Jesus chose the word ecclesia to call what he was going to start. That word has meaning. There are two things that people always say about Pierre. They say, first of all, he says, when you ask him a question, he says, what does the Bible say? That's the first thing they say. Another thing they say is, Pierre says, words have meaning. And you can't just play with the meanings. And a word has a meaning at the time it's used that it may not have a couple hundred years later. For example, when we read about the rapture, and this isn't in my notes, so don't look for something on this, but for example, when you read in 1 Thessalonians where it says, we shall not prevent those that sleep, what does prevent mean to us? It means to stop them. That's not what the word meant in 1611. That's not the origin of the word. Pre means before. Vent is the Latin word to go. It meant to go before. And so he's saying, we won't go before those that sleep. See, so you have to know what the words meant at the time. Well, ecclesia, at the time Jesus used it, meant an assembly of people called out from their homes to meet together to conduct business. He says, my ecclesia, my group of people that are called out of their homes to meet together to do my business is what I'm going to build. And that's what we're looking for. Its head is the Lord Jesus Christ. It's not the Pope. It's not whatever it's not the chief bishop of the Presbyterians or whatever they call their people. I don't know what they are. And all those things. It's the Lord Jesus Christ. Its only rule for faith and practice is the Bible. This, folks, right here, is all we have. If I don't have this to preach, I don't have anything to preach. And while I'm on that, and I don't know what everybody feels like on this, but let me tell you something. The only way you can have this is if you use the King James Bible. Because I'm going to tell you this. The other Bibles do not say the same thing. They do not. Did you know that the other Bibles don't even know over in Zechariah a prophecy about they will recognize it by the wounds in his hands? The other Bibles have it his back, his arms, between his arms and his chest. One of them even goes so far, it says, a black eye he got by running into a door. Now, folks, they can't even figure that out. I have no use for them. But that's our only, everything's got to be based on everything. Next one. I clicked two, but on mine. But the next one, its government is congregational. That means the congregation runs things. But its government is executive and not legislative. In other words, the only thing a church can do is execute the commands of the Lord. We cannot make up new laws. We cannot make up new rules. And all members are equal. Every member of Plains Baptist Church has the same power in a vote. The pastor has one vote, and every member has one vote. They're all equal. Its members are only saved and scripturally baptized people. Now, listen, I don't care how careful you are, you're going to get unsaved people in a church, because there's some pretty good fakers. But they have to have a credible testimony of salvation and be scripturally baptized. I could spend an hour on that too. The ordinances are believers' baptism and the Lord's Supper. And here again, I could spend hours on those two things. Its officers are pastors, also called bishops and elders, and deacons. And they are officers only in keeping things in order. They're not officers that have, the pastors rule over the people, but only in the fact that they guide the people. They are not dictators, they are not kings. Its work is the carrying out of the Great Commission. Today we put all of our emphasis on soul winning, which is 1/3 of the Great Commission, and we kind of neglect the other two. And we're to do all of them. Oh, by the way, I asked your pastor last night, I said, what is the purpose of the church assembled? And he's the first man that ever gave me the right answer. First preacher I've ever talked to and asked that question. He said, growing the saints. That's not the words he used, but it's building up the Christians. That's why you come together as a church, to be built up so you can go out into the world and minister. That's what it's all about. Its financial plan is tithes and offerings of God's people. No bake sales, no rummage sales. Don't run businesses on the side to finance the church. The church and its ministries are paid for by the tithes and offerings of God's people. It's weapons of warfare. They're spiritual, not carnal. I remember when I first came into the Baptist church, I started out as a Pentecostal, just so you'll know. And I became a Baptist, and that's why I'm so strong as a Baptist. I would never be anything else. I used to hear people say, if somebody asked me what I would be if I wasn't a Baptist, I'd say I'd be ashamed, and I used to think that was arrogant. If I wasn't a Baptist today, I'd be ashamed. I would mean I haven't learned something somewhere. But we don't use the world's methods. If you use the world's methods to bring people into your church, you know what you'll get? The world's people. Number 12, independence. There's no control over this church other than the Lord Jesus Christ. There's nobody up there that says, hey, you've got to do it this way. You got to preach this. You got on this Sunday, you got to preach this subject. On this Sunday, don't have any of that stuff. The pastor is the under shepherd here, and his authority only goes where Christ gives him authority. But they're independent. Okay. Now, I call this series, and we didn't see it on the first slide. We will in the next session. But I call this series From Philadelphia to Philadelphia. This book I wrote right here called Le Cathare. That's French. It means the Cathari. And you'll find out later why I use that word. But the subtitle is From Philadelphia to Philadelphia. That's what I call this series. And the reason I call it that is because of where our freedom started, the fight for our freedom started. Baptist heritage is patterned after the church in Philadelphia in Revelation chapter 3. It's patterned after that. The church was in Philadelphia, Turkey, not Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Okay, in Turkey. You'll see it on a map a little later. Jesus gave that church an open door that no man can shut. He opened up a door for that church to minister, to reach out to this world, and it still has not been closed. It is still open to us. Problem is, we're not going through it, but it's still open to us. It was because they were faithful to his word and to his name. That's why he gave them the open door. Now, there was another church. There was also no fault found with that church, but it didn't have the strength to go on, and he just promised to comfort them. But this church, he gave them an open door. And that was a pure church. He promised to keep them from the tribulation. That's promised us the rapture of the saints before the tribulation. That's why we're pre-tribulation believers. We don't believe the tribulation is going to be halfway through or three-quarters of the way through or after the tribulation period. He told them to hold to what they had because reward will come in due time. I want you to think about some of the suffering of our ancestors. They were fed to the lions in the arena for sport and things like this. They didn't get their reward in this life, but they got their reward, or they will get it. And when persecution and difficulties come to us, we need to stay faithful because the rewards will come. Then he says, he that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. And he ends all of the letters to the 7 churches in Revelation this way. We need to listen to these things. We need to look at these things. I believe, and I'm far from being alone on this, that the 7 churches picture, first of all, 7 real churches that existed at that time. Secondly, they represent 7 types of churches that will exist at all times. But they also represent 7 periods of church history. And we can get rough ideas of when we went from one to the next, to the next, to the next. And we are now in the Laodicean church age. And you'll not convince me otherwise. So we need to listen and make sure we are not the kind of churches that he condemned. The fight for soul liberty, which is a Baptist principle, we call it religious freedom today, began with this type of churches way back when the first conflict started coming in Christianity, which is about 150 AD. And that's where the people we're going to look at a little later in this series. Philadelphia in America, with the First Amendment, is where that was won. And that's why I call this series From Philadelphia in Turkey to Philadelphia in the United States of America. Next slide. Now, your pastor already talked on this, but what's the difference between history and heritage? History are the facts of what happened in the past. Problem with this is we don't learn too much from history. But there are facts. There are things that happened in the past. Today, they're trying to rewrite it and say things are different than they were, but there are things that happened in the past. Heritage is the effect of those facts. Together, they teach us cause and effect. Why do we have freedoms in America today? Something had to cause that. Then we go back to history and find out what caused it. And that's where we are. Okay, fact, Baptists stood firm on Bible doctrine and precept and practice at great cost to themselves. It is estimated that during the Dark Ages, that's from about roughly 500 AD to the Reformation 1500 AD, 1,000 years, it's estimated that there were something between 50 and 60 million Baptists killed by the Catholic Church for standing for their faith. How big is Lincoln? How many? 300,000. Okay. Well, that's a little big. The county I live in, Whatcom County in, that was in Washington, Caldwell County in North Carolina, is about 85,000 people. You would have to wipe out that entire county, 2 to 3 times a year, every man, woman, and child, to come up with 50 to 60 million people in 1,000 years. Give you some perspective of what it costs for them to stand for this. The effect, the freedoms we have today, and we'll get more into this as we go on. A pure gospel is part of the effect of Baptist standing, and you'll read Protestant, or we'll see Protestant proof of that a little bit later. Freedom of religion is part of it. I already mentioned John Leyland, what he did. King James Bible is part of it. It is the Baptists who kept the received text that we use today to translate the King James Bible, or that the King James Bible was translated from. It was that text that was preserved by the Baptists. That's why more than 95% of all the ancient Greek manuscripts that we have and references that we have support the King James, what it's translated from. And by the way, let me tell you this. Somebody's going to come along and say, well, what about the New King James? Isn't it translated from the same text? No, it is not. They claim it is, but I can show you that it is not. And I shouldn't go here, but I'm going to. I can't help it. This is another one of my pet peeves. Let me ask you a question. Is the New King James easier to read than the King James? If you've read it, some of you might say yes. Well, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to give you a word in the King James. The word is satrap. In the New King James, I mean. That's in the New King James. Satrap. How many of you here know what satrap means? Well, that's the easy word that they use. And the difficult word that the King James uses, there's 2 words it uses. The difficult word are prince and lieutenant. So if you have to pick up a dictionary to look up a word in the New King James or any other modern version, and they all use satrap, by the way, that's just one example. If you have to pick up a dictionary to look up what those words mean, why can't you pick up a dictionary to look up what a King James Bible word means if you don't know it? And by the way, did you know that the these and the thous and the ye's, they mean something different, and that's why they're used? Those had already dropped from Common Street English by the 1611. Anyway, this isn't about the King James Bible. It's another one of my pet peeves. Okay, next. Why should we study Baptist history and heritage? First of all, there's a lot of false teaching on Baptist history. A lot of it. The Baptist History and Heritage Society, you would think they would be teaching what I'm teaching today. But here's what they say. Our best historical evidence says that Baptists came into existence in England in the early 17th century. They put it 1620 or 1621. That's what they say we came into existence. Well, folks, there's too much evidence to the contrary. That couldn't possibly be true. We're going to see testimony throughout this series that gives testimony to the fact that we're older than that. But here's an example. 100 years before that, Zwingli, a Protestant reformer in Zurich, Switzerland, was drowning Baptists because they believed in baptizing adults who had a profession of faith for or after their salvation by immersing them in water, so they drowned them. That's 100 years earlier. So how did we start in the 17th century if we were already being drowned in the 16th century? Our forefathers suffered an awful lot. Baptists are being severed from their roots, and this is a subject that I will repeat more than once. Secularists are trying to separate us from our roots. They don't want us to know who we are because they hate anything that's religious, and especially if it's Baptist. Protestant Catholics, they think freedom of religion, which is the Baptist principle, is harmful to society. And I'm going to quote Presbyterians who have said this. By the way, you know what the Presbyterian, when I say Presbyterians, when I say these different denominations, I'm not talking about necessarily the person sitting in the pew. Most of them have no idea on what their church really teaches. Just like the average Muslim has no idea on what Islam is. I'm talking about the leadership. And they think Baptist principles are harmful to society. Our own leaders. You know, one of the worst things that ever happened was Baptists started getting respectability. And everybody wants that. Don't you want to be respected? I do. For popularity and acceptance, our Baptist leaders have stopped teaching what Baptists are and why we're different from the other denominations. There's not one major Baptist homeschooling publisher that teaches anything serious about Baptist history. Not one. Unless something's come out in the last couple of years, because it's been a while since I researched this, but not one. So if you homeschool your children, I have a suggestion. Learn about Baptist history and teach it to your children so they'll know why they are what they are. And by the way, if you're not homeschooling, and you possibly can, you should. The main tool that they use to sever us from our roots is historical revisionism. That's what I talked about, that us starting in 1620. Here's some non-Baptist testimony. This first one, I like this one. It's my favorite. This is John Ridpath. He was a Methodist professor at DePauw University. He said, I should not readily admit that there was a Baptist church as far back as 100 AD. Although, without doubt, there were Baptist churches then, as all Christians were then Baptists. Now, wait a minute, John. If they were all Baptists, then shouldn't you admit that they were Baptist churches? And if that's true, then why are you a Methodist and not a Baptist? Anyway, Sir Isaac Newton, you ever heard of him? We don't think of him in religious circles too much, do we? But he said Baptists are the only known body of Christians that have never symbolized with Rome, never been part of Rome. We're not Protestants. Cardinal Hosius. Now, this is a controversial quote. I've done a lot of research on it. We're going to look at a different version of it later on in this series. But I am totally convinced after my research that it's an authentic quote. It says, if the truth of religion were to be judged by the readiness and boldness of which a man of any sect shows in suffering, then the opinion and persuasion of no sect can be truer and surer than that of the Anabaptists, since there have been none for these 1,200 years. Now, this is in 1525, I think it is. He's saying this. So 1,200 years before that takes you back to when? The 4th century, when the Catholic Church started to start. These past 1,200 years, or 1,200 years past, that have been more generally punished, or have more cheerfully and steadfastly undergone and even offered themselves to the most cruel sorts of punishment than these people. So here's a cardinal saying, there's another place where he says he was a thorn in their flesh for these 1,200 years, in the Catholic flesh. So that's testimony to our. Okay, we are, as Baptists, to be a pure people. Here it says, now the end of the commandment is charity out of a pure heart, and of a good conscience, and of faith unfeigned. That means not fake. And notice the word pure. This next verse. Seeing ye have purified your souls in obeying the truth through the Spirit unto unfeigned love. There's that true love again, or true word again, of the brethren. See that ye love one another with a pure heart. Notice that word pure. That word pure is the key Greek word katharos. I don't know if they do like the French, because in the French they pronounce a TH just like a T, so that would be katharos, but katharos, I'll do it that. That word is translated 3 different ways in the King James Bible. By the way, the best way to find out a meaning of a word in the King James Bible is see how it's translated elsewhere. The same Greek word, because Strong's didn't get it right all the time. But anyway, it's translated as clean, clear, and pure, and most often it's pure. The Church of Philadelphia was a pure Katharos church. we are to be a peculiar people. Now, some people think that means we go, no, it means we're to be different. That's all it means. It means we're to be different. It says, who gave himself for us that he might redeem us from all iniquity and purify unto himself a peculiar people zealous of good works. We're to be different. The reason we can't reach the lost today is we're not different. We don't show them anything they want. I had a man come to me when I was working in Denver before I took the church in Washington. He was a Russian Jew atheist, okay? And he came up to me one day, and he said, Pierre, why do you serve God like you do, the way he treats you? I said, what do you mean? I think he treats me pretty well. He says, well, your trucks always break it down, and you're always tight on money. Well, I've been tight on money since the day I was born. I've never had much money, but I got an awful lot of nice things that God's given me. Best thing God's ever given me is my wife. 60 years I've been married to that woman. She's put up with me that long. But he's given us a lot of antiques. He's given us a lot of nice things. And but I've never had much money. And I said, yeah, but I've always got the money for what I need. But he says, your truck's always broken down. I says, yeah, but you see, I have an advantage. When my truck breaks down, my baby brother's the boss, and I get to use his, so I still could drive. I've got a truck to drive. And then we started walking down to the next thing he said was, oh, besides that, there is no God. So we started walking down to get our next loads. We were couriers. We were going to get our next load to take out. And as we're walking down, he says, you know, Pierre, he says, God hasn't been fair to the Jews. And I said, Mike, you can have it one way or the other. There is no God, or God hasn't been fair to Jews. And he got that real quick. Because I've never met an atheist. I've met a lot of proclaimed atheists, but I've never met an atheist. Anyway, that's just rabbits. I can chase rabbits all day. To be peculiar is, we are to be peculiar in our doctrine. I'll get this right here in a minute. That means our doctrine should always be based on the Bible. What is doctrine? Anybody want to give me a definition of doctrine? You don't count, Pastor. Okay, doctrine. Did you know in the military they have doctrine? They have a doctrine that you follow to fight this kind of a war, and a doctrine that you follow to fight this kind of a war. Doctrine is what you teach. That's what it means. It's what you teach. It's what you believe and what you teach, but it should be all Bible-based. We are to be peculiar in our conduct. We should live holy lives, lives that show the world that we're different. Now, I'm not talking about some church that comes down and he says, you got to have this rule and this rule and this rule. I'm not talking about that kind of stuff. You see, it's not a matter of the outside. It's a matter of the heart. Our heart should cause us to live holy lives. I better hurry up here. We're to be peculiar in our willingness to die for what we believe. Have you ever given that any thought? Would you die for what you believe? Our Baptist ancestors did. There was one man back at Reformation time, a Baptist, and he was tortured and really suffered greatly. And finally he said, okay, I'll recant. They took him into the courtroom to recant. And he got in there, and the Holy Spirit got a hold of him, and he absolutely refused to recant. And he was killed a horrible death. Hubbemeyer, I think, was his name. Would we do that? Now, I could understand if you're going through a lot of pain, you say, okay. I can understand that. But would you be willing to suffer and die for what you believe? Our ancestor did. We're to be peculiar in our evangelism. I might tell this story twice in this series, but the Waldensian young people, who are Cathars, by the way, the Waldensian young people would learn a portable trade. What do I mean by a portable trade? Remember Paul? He made tents. It was something you do wherever you went. And they would come down out of the safety of the mountains into the flatlands to reach the lost Catholic people, knowing full well that their average survival time before death was 2 years. But they cared enough for those people down there to be willing to suffer like that. These are all characteristics of our spiritual ancestors. This is what they were. This is what we should be. Do I know if I could suffer like they did? No, I don't know. but I do know God. And God can give you grace through anything he allows you to go through. Okay, I've got to hurry here. By the end of the third or second century, there were 360 registered, that they have on record. Qatar churches in this area that you see outlined in red, that's Turkey. And by the same time, it has spread all the way across Greece and northern Italy and into southern France, which is where I was a missionary. It's where I met these people. The Lord has kept his word. God has had pure churches in every generation since the foundation of the first church in Jerusalem. The churches were persecuted for their faithfulness to God's word. We're going to look at a lot of this stuff as we go through this. An example of one of these churches was the church in Philadelphia. Here's what he said to the church. He says, I know thy works. Behold, I have set before thee an open door, and no man can shut it. For thou hast a little strength, and hast kept thy word, and hast not denied my name. He set before them an open door. There's an open door for us today, especially in America. No man can close that door. Only God. Do you realize that Satan can't do anything to you unless he goes to God and gets permission first? They had a little strength. That's why he blessed them, because they had a little strength. If they'd had much strength, he probably wouldn't have blessed them, because they'd have done it in their own strength. I can do all things through Christ, who strengtheneth me. They kept his word, and they had not denied his name. In the next session, I'm going to introduce you to some of these people.